They called it the Dream Factory, but for some of its brightest stars, Hollywood became a nightmare in disguise. We remember the glamour, but few talk about the legends who lost everything: fortune, fame, and sometimes even their dignity. How could the world's most adored faces end up forgotten and destitute? Tonight, we journey past the red carpet into the shadows most never see. Some stories end with applause, others with a silence that reveals far more than fame ever could. Mabel Normand. There's a cruel irony in the story of Mabel Normand, one of Hollywood's original funny women, and a trailblazer who helped shape the art of screen comedy, yet died alone and penniless, her legacy nearly erased by scandal and misfortune. Born in 1892 to a working-class family in Staten Island, Mabel was drawn to art, modeling for illustrators before the movies came calling. Her comedic spark soon caught fire in silent pictures, launching her to stardom as one of Mack Sennett's legendary Keystone Cops. She was a rare force, acting, directing, and even running her own production company at a time when women were seldom allowed behind the camera. But the dazzling heights of early Hollywood came with a dangerous edge. Mabel's career flourished alongside titans like Charlie Chaplin and Fatty Arbuckle, but the press was relentless. When director William Desmond Taylor was murdered in 1922, Mabel became infamous as one of the last people to see him alive. Even without formal charges, the rumor mill was merciless, linking her to a crime she didn't commit and poisoning her reputation. Soon after, the Fatty Arbuckle scandal, where her close friend was accused of a heinous crime, cast a new shadow, and studios, fearful of bad publicity, distanced themselves from her. Unable to find work, Mabel battled not only professional exile, but mounting health issues. Tuberculosis and substance abuse slowly destroyed her once vivacious spirit. Her fortune dwindled, her circle of friends faded, and Hollywood forgot the laughter she brought. She died in 1930 at only 37, her final years marked by poverty and obscurity. Today, Mabel Normand stands as a haunting reminder of how quickly fame fades, and how even the brightest icons can be left with nothing. Barbara Payton. Barbara Payton's story reads like a warning etched in Hollywood's Walk of Fame, a tale of raw charisma crushed by addiction, scandal, and the unforgiving glare of the tabloids. Rising from a modest background, Payton burst onto the silver screen in the late 1940s, with a presence that was impossible to ignore. Her beauty won her a coveted Universal Pictures contract and roles alongside the likes of James Cagney and Gary Cooper. Audiences and directors alike saw something electric in Barbara. She was meant for stardom, but beneath the glamour was a young woman haunted by poor choices and public scandal. Her notorious affair with actor Franchot Tone, while engaged to Tom Neal, set off a storm in the gossip columns. The resulting love triangle exploded in violence when Neal brutally assaulted Tone, landing him in the hospital, and Barbara in the center of a scandal that Hollywood wouldn't soon forgive. Executives blacklisted her, and quality roles dried up almost overnight. Barbara, now persona non grata, watched as the life she'd built slipped through her fingers. Spiraling out of the spotlight, Payton turned to alcohol and substance abuse, trying to dull the pain of her lost career. She took work wherever she could: low-budget films, stage productions, even the occasional tawdry tabloid exposé about her own downfall. Her finances evaporated, replaced by mounting arrests for public intoxication and solicitation. By the 1960s, the once glamorous starlet was living in squalor, far from the luxury she'd known. Estranged from Hollywood and abandoned by the industry that once celebrated her, Payton died in 1967 at just 39, a victim of heart and liver failure brought on by years of abuse. When she passed, she was penniless, her legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the high cost of fame. Judy Garland. No name in Golden Age Hollywood shines quite like Judy Garland's, yet her story is a devastating testament to how fame and fortune can so easily become a mirage. Garland, immortalized as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, became a global sensation at just 17. Her voice, soaring, emotional, unmistakable, captivated audiences for decades. MGM considered her a crown jewel, but their control over her life was absolute. Studio executives micromanaged her image, prescribed her amphetamines to keep her slim and energetic, and gave her sleeping pills when the day was done. It was a relentless, toxic cycle that sparked lifelong battles with addiction and self-doubt. Even as Judy dazzled in films and on stage, her personal life crumbled. She endured 5 marriages, all stormy and fraught, and found herself betrayed by managers and so-called friends who siphoned off her earnings. By the 1950s, despite earning millions, she faced massive debts, especially to the IRS, whose back taxes bled her dry. With nowhere left to turn, Garland accepted exhausting concert tours, sometimes performing while gravely ill, just to keep her creditors at bay. Even then, the money never lasted. Poor management and her own generosity meant she was always scrambling for her next paycheck. Garland's final years were a patchwork of desperate comebacks and crushing setbacks. She lived in rented rooms, borrowing from friends, her health in rapid decline. On June 22, 1969, she died alone in a London apartment at 47, an accidental overdose. But the world understood she'd been fighting a losing battle for years. At her death, she left behind not a fortune, but debts and heartbreak. The industry that created Judy Garland never gave her peace, and when she was gone, it barely looked back. Her brilliance lingers, but her life is a haunting warning of what the golden age could cost. Veronica Lake. Veronica Lake's name once conjured images of Hollywood glamour. Her signature peekaboo hairstyle and smoky gaze were the epitome of 1940s sophistication. As a leading lady in classics like This Gun for Hire, Sullivan's Travels, and I Married a Witch, Lake was a defining face of the film noir era. She paired with Alan Ladd in some of the most iconic roles of the decade, and her allure seemed unbreakable. But fame in Hollywood, especially for women, is fragile, and Veronica's story would unravel with chilling speed. Behind the silver screen persona was a young woman thrust into stardom without a roadmap for survival. Lake's popularity soared during the war years, but as trends shifted and her personal struggles mounted, the studios grew distant. Typecasting limited her opportunities, and her career stalled as she aged out of the ingenue roles. Divorces, financial missteps, and a growing dependency on alcohol only deepened her troubles. By the late 1940s, the woman who once graced magazine covers was forced to declare bankruptcy, owing over $100,000, a staggering sum for the time. Lake's decline was brutal. She vanished from the spotlight and took odd jobs to survive, including stints as a waitress and hotel clerk. Patrons were stunned to see the former screen siren serving drinks, her movie star mystique replaced by the exhaustion of hardship. The Hollywood elite offered no safety net. Lake attempted a modest comeback in the late 1960s, even publishing an autobiography, but the money was fleeting. When she died in 1973 from hepatitis and kidney failure at just 50 years old, she was nearly penniless. Her ashes went unclaimed for years, a cruel symbol of how quickly the world had forgotten her. Yet, for film lovers, Veronica Lake remains forever iconic, a cautionary tale of beauty, fame, and the dangers of being discarded by the industry she once ruled. Marie Provost. Marie Provost was once the toast of Hollywood's silent and early sound eras, a vivacious actress whose comedic timing and sparkling charm made her a star in the 1920s. She began as a model before joining Mack Sennett's famous Bathing Beauties, which catapulted her into the limelight. Her transition to leading roles was seamless, starring in acclaimed films like The Marriage Circle and Kiss Me Again under directors such as Ernst Lubitsch. Provost's performances were hailed for their wit and sophistication, and she was considered one of the brightest hopes of her era. But Hollywood's affection is fickle, and the transition to sound films exposed the industry's brutal disregard for its former favorites. Though Provost adapted to talkies, her roles dwindled as younger, fresher faces were brought in. Personal tragedy soon compounded her professional woes. The loss of her mother left her emotionally shattered. To cope, Provost turned to food and alcohol, resulting in weight gain that further reduced her job prospects in an image-obsessed industry. By the 1930s, Provost's savings were depleted. She took whatever roles she could get, mostly supporting parts, but the pay was a pittance compared to her heyday. Alone and largely forgotten, she struggled to afford basic necessities. Her final years were marked by deep poverty and declining health, her former glamour a distant memory. On January 21, 1937, Marie Provost was found dead in her modest Los Angeles apartment. She had succumbed to acute alcoholism and malnutrition at just 40 years old. Neighbors were alerted by the barking of her loyal dog, who had stayed by her side after her passing. Provost's tragic end exposed the ruthless nature of Hollywood's golden age, where stars could be discarded without a second thought once their marketability faded. Buster Keaton. To speak of silent film comedy without mentioning Buster Keaton is to miss the very foundation of the art. Known as the Great Stone Face for his deadpan expression and incomparable physical comedy, Keaton was a genius behind and in front of the camera. Films like The General, Sherlock Jr., and Steamboat Bill Jr. defined an era, blending breathtaking stunts, inventive visuals, and an unmistakable sense of wonder. At his peak in the 1920s, Keaton was one of the industry's top creative forces, enjoying both financial and artistic freedom. But Hollywood can be a cruel partner. In the late 1920s, Keaton's fortunes took a turn when he signed with MGM. The studio offered financial stability, but stripped him of creative control, forcing him into formulaic roles that stifled his artistry. Worse still, the arrival of sound films sent shockwaves through his career. His unique talents were undervalued, and his silent-era brilliance was all but ignored. Battling the loss of his professional identity, Keaton fell into alcoholism, a downward spiral that cost him his marriage, his fortune, and his reputation. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Keaton was forced to accept bit parts, work as an uncredited gag writer, and scrape by as Hollywood moved on to newer stars. His films, now revered as masterpieces, were then seen as relics of a bygone era. Only in his later years did Keaton enjoy a modest revival, making cameo appearances and even starring in commercials. But the financial security of his golden days never returned. When Buster Keaton died in 1966, he left behind not riches, but a body of work that would later be hailed as essential cinema. His final years, lived in relative obscurity and instability, were a stark contrast to the artistic heights he once reached, a sobering lesson on how even the greatest can be left behind by the industry they helped build. Bud Abbott. Bud Abbott's name was once synonymous with laughter, wit, and the golden era of comedy. As half of the legendary duo Abbott and Costello, Bud Abbott helped craft routines that would become American treasures, with their "Who's on First" sketch still quoted and celebrated decades later. At the height of their fame in the 1940s and early 1950s, Abbott and Costello were among Hollywood's biggest box office draws, starring in classics like Buck Privates and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Money flowed in, and the world seemed to be at Bud Abbott's feet. But beneath the surface, financial mismanagement and personal vices were slowly unraveling his future. While the comedy pair became household names, Bud's penchant for gambling and a generous but unrestrained lifestyle began to drain his considerable earnings. Adding to his woes was the changing tide of show business. Comedy styles evolved, and the duo's routines began to lose favor with younger audiences. The eventual split from Lou Costello in the mid-1950s, following years of creative differences and financial disputes, marked the beginning of Bud Abbott's financial and personal decline. Without the steady income and spotlight of their partnership, Bud found it increasingly difficult to land work. He attempted a return to entertainment with voice work on an animated Abbott and Costello show, but the effort brought little financial relief. Health problems, including epilepsy, further limited his ability to earn. By the time of his death in 1974, Bud Abbott was living in modest circumstances, worlds away from the mansions and limelight of his prime. The man who once commanded top billing in Hollywood's biggest theaters died in relative obscurity, his estate left with little to show for decades of success. Abbott's legacy is a stark reminder that even the greatest talents can be brought low by bad luck, bad decisions, and an industry that so often moves on without looking back. Wallace Reed. Wallace Reed was Hollywood's original golden boy, an actor whose face sold out theaters and whose charisma set the standard for matinee idols during the silent film era. With his chiseled good looks, athletic build, and breezy charm, Reed starred in more than 100 films, including crowd pleasers like The Roaring Road and The Affairs of Anatole. Studios banked on his appeal, often casting him as the all-American hero, the man every woman wanted and every man wanted to be. Off-screen, Reed's popularity was just as dazzling. He seemed to have it all: a loving family, a sterling reputation, and the adulation of millions. But behind the glittering public image was a darker reality. A man caught in the relentless machine of early Hollywood, where the demands were grueling and the support non-existent. In 1919, Reed suffered a serious injury in a train accident while filming on location. To keep their star working, studio doctors prescribed morphine to help him cope with the pain and finish the shoot. Like so many after him, Reed quickly became addicted. Instead of offering help, the studio system doubled down, keeping him working at a breakneck pace and feeding his dependency rather than risking delays or public scandal. As the years passed, Reed's health deteriorated visibly. The once vibrant star grew gaunt and withdrawn, increasingly unable to meet the punishing demands of fame. His addiction became impossible to hide, and the industry that had built him up now turned its back. Reed's final films were a shadow of his earlier triumphs, his performances strained and his spirit fading. Isolated and broken, he was sent to a sanitarium in an attempt to recover, but it was too late. In 1923, at just 31 years old, Wallace Reed died, destitute, addicted, and largely abandoned by the very system that had created him. His tragic end was one of Hollywood's first cautionary tales, a stark warning about the cost of fame and the callousness of an industry that prized profits over people. Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi's piercing eyes and heavy Hungarian accent became forever etched in film history the moment he first donned the black cape as Count Dracula in 1931. His performance was iconic, so powerful that it shaped the image of the cinematic vampire for generations. Lugosi instantly became a household name, synonymous with mystery and horror, and for a moment, the world was at his feet. But fame, particularly in Hollywood, is a double-edged sword. Lugosi's association with Dracula soon became a curse, typecasting him in similar roles and preventing him from exploring his full dramatic range. Despite his early successes, Lugosi's financial troubles began to mount as his career faltered. Studio pay was inconsistent and often modest, and Lugosi's limited English and lack of business savvy left him vulnerable to poor contracts and bad investments. He lived beyond his means, convinced the next role would bring a return to glory. As the horror craze waned and studios found new faces, Lugosi found himself relegated to low-budget productions and secondary roles, often working for a fraction of what he'd once commanded. To make matters worse, chronic pain from sciatica led to a morphine addiction that further hindered his ability to work and made him an unreliable hire in Hollywood's eyes. By the 1950s, Lugosi was struggling to secure even minor parts, and the money ran out quickly. He spent his final years in a modest Los Angeles apartment, depending on friends and fans for support. When he died in 1956, Bela Lugosi had little to his name, a tragic end for a man whose talent and legacy deserved so much more. His funeral was paid for by fans and friends, a poignant final curtain for one of cinema's most unforgettable icons, haunted by poverty in his final act. Terry Thomas. Terry Thomas was the epitome of British charm and wit, instantly recognizable by his gap-toothed grin and knack for playing the lovable cad. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, he became an international favorite, making audiences laugh in hits like School for Scoundrels, I'm All Right, Jack, and It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. Terry Thomas wasn't just a star. He was a comedic institution, celebrated for his clever timing and ability to play both aristocrat and rogue with equal delight. At his peak, he enjoyed a lavish lifestyle, living in luxury between London and the sun-soaked coasts of Europe. But the tides of show business can turn swiftly and cruelly. As tastes in comedy changed and the slapstick styles that had made him famous fell out of fashion, the roles began to dry up. More devastatingly, Terry Thomas was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in the early 1970s. The once energetic star struggled to remember lines, let alone perform the physical comedy that had been his trademark. With the disease gradually robbing him of his ability to work, his income evaporated. Medical bills mounted, and his savings dwindled. Despite his legendary status, the industry that once celebrated him offered little help. Friends and fellow actors quietly sent money to support him, but it wasn't enough to stave off hardship. In the 1980s, Terry Thomas was living in a small flat, a world away from the opulence of his heyday, and dependent on charitable donations to cover basic living expenses. He died in 1990 at age 78, with almost nothing left from a lifetime of work that brought joy to millions. Terry Thomas's story is a heartbreaking example of how easily fame and fortune can vanish, leaving even the brightest stars struggling in the shadows of their former glory. Raone Novaro. Raone Novaro's story is the very definition of a Hollywood rise and fall, one that began in the silent era's glittering embrace and ended in tragic obscurity. Born in Mexico, Novaro arrived in Los Angeles as a teenager, part of a wave of Latin American talent seeking opportunity in early Hollywood. Blessed with matinee idol looks and a gentle charisma, he quickly became one of MGM's most bankable stars. His breakthrough came in the epic Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, 1925, where his quiet intensity and soulful eyes captivated audiences worldwide. Novaro became a global sensation, his name as marketable as Valentino's, earning a fortune and the adoration of millions. Yet, fame in Hollywood has always come with a price. Novaro's success masked a life shadowed by personal turmoil and the unforgiving pressures of the industry. As the film business shifted from silent pictures to sound, Novaro made the transition more gracefully than many of his peers, starring in musicals and dramas throughout the 1930s. But beneath the surface, his world was crumbling. The studio system, notorious for its rigidity and prejudice, limited Novaro's roles as he aged, and his stardom faded in the face of younger rivals and changing tastes. His private life, kept secret due to the era's moral codes, brought him heartbreak and isolation, especially as rumors and innuendos chipped away at his public image. Financial mismanagement, mounting legal bills, and the absence of a true support system left Novaro with dwindling resources. The once celebrated star was forced to sell his belongings and take small roles in television and low-budget films to survive. His final years were marked by poverty and solitude, living alone in a modest Los Angeles home. In 1968, Novaro's life ended violently and tragically. He was murdered by two young men he had hired, a shocking crime that exposed both his vulnerability and the callous indifference of a city that had forgotten him. Novaro's death was headline news for a moment, but Hollywood quickly moved on. His legacy remains as both a silent-era icon and a haunting example of how fortune and fame can vanish, leaving only shadows where a star once shone. John Garfield. John Garfield was the tough, brooding antihero long before the term became Hollywood shorthand. Rising from New York's rough Lower East Side, Garfield's naturalistic acting style revolutionized the screen and helped pave the way for method acting in American cinema. With films like The Postman, Always Rings Twice, Body and Soul, and Force of Evil, Garfield carved out a reputation as a fearless and intensely committed performer. He was Warner Bros.' go-to for roles that required a raw, working-class authenticity, an outsider who electrified the screen every time. But the same fire that made Garfield great also made him a target. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Red Scare swept through Hollywood. Garfield's refusal to name names before the House Un-American Activities Committee led to his blacklisting, effectively ending his career in its prime. The industry turned its back, and work dried up overnight. Garfield was not only shut out from the studios, but also drained financially by legal fees and the cost of simply surviving while unable to work. Compounding his woes was Garfield's generous spirit and love of gambling, habits that once seemed charming, but now left him with mounting debts and little safety net. His health, already fragile from the constant stress and pressure, began to crumble. Living in a small New York apartment, far from the mansions of Hollywood, Garfield was worn down by both industry and fate. On May 21, 1952, he died of a heart attack at just 39, a casualty of politics, principle, and the unforgiving machine of show business. John Garfield's legacy endures in film, but his tragic downfall is a stark warning of how quickly Hollywood can devour its brightest talents, leaving them destitute in the very city where they once reigned. Dorothy Dandridge. Dorothy Dandridge's name belongs in the history books, not only as a dazzling actress and singer, but as a barrier breaker who endured the harshest realities of racism in Hollywood. She first stunned audiences as a nightclub performer, captivating with her poise, beauty, and a voice that could silence any room. In 1954, Dandridge made history as the first black woman to be nominated for a Best Actress Oscar, thanks to her fiery, unforgettable performance in Carmen Jones. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed Hollywood was ready to open its doors. But behind the scenes, Dandridge's success was far more fragile than it looked. Roles for black actresses were limited and often demeaning, and even when she landed a starring part, pay was meager compared to her white counterparts. Studios denied her the chance to become the leading lady she deserved to be, pigeonholing her in secondary or stereotyped roles. She battled constant discrimination, not just in casting, but in daily life. On movie sets, in hotels, and at premieres, she was met with closed doors and cold shoulders. Financial exploitation worsened her plight. Mismanagement by advisors, failed marriages, and a desperate struggle to support her special needs daughter left her with mounting debt and few resources. By the mid-1960s, work had all but vanished. Her health declined, her personal life was in shambles, and she was forced to sell her possessions just to get by. On September 8, 1965, Dandridge was found dead in her apartment, with only a few dollars to her name. Her death, ruled an accidental overdose, was shrouded in speculation. She was just 42. Today, her legacy is that of a trailblazer who endured crushing injustice and opened doors for countless others, even as the industry abandoned her in her darkest hour. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn was Hollywood's original swashbuckler, the dashing, reckless hero of Captain Blood, the adventures of Robin Hood, and countless tales of high adventure. Audiences couldn't get enough of his charm, his good looks, and his apparent ability to live as wildly off-screen as he did on screen. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Flynn was box office gold, earning vast sums and living life in the fast lane. He sailed yachts, bought mansions, and threw legendary parties that would make even today's celebrities blush. But beneath the glamour, Flynn's world was crumbling. His appetite for excess, drinking, womanizing, and gambling created chaos that his finances could not withstand. Legal troubles, including highly publicized trials, drained his savings and shattered his public image. Lavish spending, paired with a complete lack of financial planning, meant that every dollar he earned was quickly spent. Debts to the IRS continued to mount, and failed investments only made things worse. By the 1950s, Flynn's health was in decline, ravaged by years of heavy drinking and reckless living. Roles became harder to find, and those that came his way paid less and less. He moved from mansion to small apartments, and even lived as a guest in friends' homes to make ends meet. When Flynn died of a heart attack in Vancouver in 1959, he was just 50 years old. His once glittering estate was left in deep debt, and his family scrambling to cover even the basic costs of his funeral. The image of Flynn as Hollywood royalty endures, but his tragic end is a cautionary tale of how even the brightest stars can fall from the highest heights, brought low by a relentless lifestyle and the indifference of an industry quick to forget. Rosco "Fatty" Arbuckle. Rosco "Fatty" Arbuckle was once one of Hollywood's biggest stars, literally and figuratively. A gifted comedian, actor, and director, Arbuckle's slapstick routines delighted millions in the 1910s and early 1920s. His contract with Paramount was groundbreaking, earning him a staggering $1 million per year and making him one of the most influential figures in early film. Arbuckle's comedic genius paved the way for other legends, but his story would become one of Hollywood's most notorious tragedies. In 1921, Arbuckle's world was turned upside down by the infamous Virginia rap scandal. Accused of a crime he did not commit, Arbuckle endured 3 sensationalized trials that ultimately ended in acquittal and a formal apology from the jury. But the damage was done. The press eviscerated his reputation, and Will Hayes, head of the newly formed Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, banned Arbuckle from working in the industry. The studios turned their backs, and his immense fortune evaporated in legal fees, lost income, and mounting debts. Though he later worked under a pseudonym, directing and attempting a comeback in the 1930s, the shadow of scandal never left him. Arbuckle's health declined, his opportunities dwindled, and he was left struggling to support himself. When he died of a heart attack in 1933 at just 46, he was financially destitute, a far cry from the king of comedy he had once been. Arbuckle's rise and fall stand as a chilling reminder of how quickly fortunes can change in Hollywood, where fame is fleeting, and the past can never be fully outrun. Hollywood's golden lights burn bright, but for so many icons, the glow faded far too soon. Their names once drew crowds and defined an era, yet behind every marquee was a real person, often left struggling when the applause died away. Their stories are more than cautionary tales. They're stark reminders of an industry that giveth and taketh away. As we remember these legends, let's not just recall their fame, but the humanity and the hard truths they left behind.